Welcome to lecture number 7, the British Mandate, part 1. Let's have a look at this diagram. Starting from the left, we focus first on the Ottoman Empire, which will crumble and be substituted by a British Mandate following World War I. Still, during the Ottoman Empire, when we focus on Palestine, we have first Aliyah and second Aliyah, which we discussed in the last lecture. The conquest of labor and the conquest of land being the two main policies that the second Aliyah immigrant settlers adopted. Let me remind you, conquest of labor was the attempt to replace the Arab worker, mainly in agriculture, the Arab Felahin, and take their jobs into the hands of the first and second Aliyah Jewish agricultural workers. The aim of this policy of replacing the Arab worker was targeted in order to give jobs to the Jewish immigrants so as they can stay in the country. We discussed the fact that without Jewish immigration, the whole Zionist project obviously will not have succeeded. So one of the main aims was to find jobs for these people coming into the country. And they believed that they should take the jobs of the Arab worker in agriculture. That was the conquest of labor, the conquest of land, the idea that land should be redeemed from Arab hands. This was the attempt of the Zionist organizations to purchase tracts of land on which new Jewish settlements, mainly rural settlements, were established. We discussed that during the second Aliyah, the kibbutz is established, which epitomize the idea of conquest of labor and conquest of land together, since the kibbutz enabled settling Jewish immigrants on Jewish-owned land purchased by the Jewish National Fund, the JNF, and these people live together in a communal way. They share the land, and from their own work they could subsist. So they didn't have to become high workers, needed to compete with the Arab worker in the moshavot of the first Aliyah. A couple of things to mention also in terms of this period of time. Remember that in 1876, the first Ottoman constitutional era began with the establishment of a constitution and the opening of a parliament. But these two were shut down by the Sultan Abdul Hamid II just 2 years after. Only in 1908 there will be a reopening of the parliament and the re-establishment of the constitution via the Young Turk Revolution, which opened the political space for freedom of press, which was used by both Zionists and Arabs in Palestine to criticize each other. This is what Rashid Khalid in his book called the Press Wars. In terms of Arab resistance, still during this period of first into second Aliyah, let us remember that there were the Felahin, the Arab peasants, that first launched a sort of opposition to Jewish settlement, and only later urban resistance was shaped at a number of levels. We have some Arab Palestinians that are members of parliament in the Ottoman parliament, where they raise the issue of Zionist settlement and demand from the Ottoman government to restrict Jewish immigration into Palestine and also to restrict the selling of land to Zionist organizations. In addition, we just mentioned the Arabic press that flourished during this period, and also there were a number of civil society organizations and political parties that were established, that the main tone was opposition to the Zionist project. When we put all this together from the viewpoint of the Jewish settlement or the new Yishuv, so to sum up again, we are talking about an emergent sort of para-state with institutions across a number of social spheres. We have separated, self-segregated rural cooperative settlements, the kibbutzim. Also separated neighborhoods are built in towns and cities for Jews. So Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe don't live with Arabs and Sephardi Jews. We have an emergent political system of the Yishuv, education based on the Hebrew language and culture, and also establishment of paramilitary organizations. We talk about the Bar Giora group and then the Ashomer group. There are more institutions that are going to be established, like the Histadrut. We will see this during this lecture. Now, to look into what's going to happen in this lecture, so we stopped last week close to the beginning of World War I. We are going to discuss what happened in Palestine during World War I, and then how the British received from the League of Nations the mandate to control Palestine, and what happens during these about 20 years that the British rule over Palestine, all the way into the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, and the tragic event of the Nakba, the tragedy of the Palestinian people, where close to 800,000 Palestinians were ethnically cleansed from the land by Jewish military forces. Map of the Middle East show us just the state of affairs before World War I. Look please at the area of the Ottoman Empire in light green, and you can see that at this point the Ottomans were ruling only over what is now Turkey, Syria, Lebanon. You can see there in green light also Palestine, the Hejaz region of the Arabian Peninsula, and a sort of strip cutting through Iraq. These are the territories that were left to the Ottomans just before World War I. If you go back to about 3 weeks ago and look into the maps where the Ottomans ruled at the highest point of territorial expansion, you will see that they held territories in North Africa and also beyond to the east into further than Iraq. So the green light area is all that remained for the Ottomans, and they are going to lose most of it. In fact, all of it, apart from what is to become modern Turkey after World War I. During the early stages of World War I, there are three events or documents that are very significant and are going to shape the fate of Palestine. These three events and documents are the Hussein McMahon Correspondence, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and the Balfour Declaration. So please pay attention to this event because understanding them and the relation between them will help understanding what is about to happen with Palestine after World War I. In July 1914, the war began, and the same year in December, the Ottoman Empire joined the war on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. Now, during the war, Palestine will become an actual battlefield. The Ottomans will forcibly recruit people into their army. There will be hunger, unemployment, and a lot of misery for the people living there. During the war, the British were active in the Arabian Peninsula and in the Levant, agitating against the Ottoman amongst Arab elites. This agitation was based on appeals to Arab national identity and were led particularly in the Arabian Peninsula by British agent T.E. Lawrence, the famous Lawrence from Arab. Lawrence and the British were selling to the Arab elite a sort of Arab unity under the leadership of the Hashemites, who were the family custodians of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and they were also descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. The leader of the Hashemite family was the Sharif Hussein, known as Hussein of Mecca. From mid-1915, the British were contacting the Sharif Hussein of Mecca to offer an anti-Ottoman alliance. So a series of letters were written between the Sharif Hussein of Mecca and Henry McMahon. Henry McMahon was the British High Commissioner in Egypt. The exchange of letters between McMahon and the Sharif Hussein led eventually to an agreement in June 1916, where the British would cooperate with Hussein's Arab forces to overthrow Ottoman rule from the Arabian Peninsula and other parts, Arab parts of the Ottoman Empire, and in exchange, the British will support and sponsor an Arab independent state, a sort of Arab caliphate. Now, during the first stages of the war, the Ottomans were repressing Arab nationalists, Arab political parties, and civil associations because they were very suspicious of potential connections and support on the side of the Arabs for the British and the French. And indeed, the British were corresponding with the Sharif Hussein in order to reach an agreement. And as I said, that agreement was achieved in mid-1916. At this point, I would like you to read two brief documents. One is a fact sheet explaining in a very didactic fashion the Hussein McMahon correspondence, and then I'm asking you to read the actual correspondence, or at least to skim over it. These two readings are in Moodle in this week's lectures. And then try to answer the simple question of what were the British basically promising the Sharif Hussein. The Arab revolt in the Arabian Peninsula and other parts of the Ottoman Empire continued until the defeat of the Ottomans at the end of World War I, raising hopes for the fulfillment of the vision that was outlined by McMahon for British sponsorship of an independent, large independent Arab state in the Levant and the Western Arabian Peninsula. However, other factors will emerge to complicate this vision. First of all, let's look into what is known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So, literally, at the time that the British were promising the Hashemites and the Sharif Hussein to promote and sponsor a sort of Arab caliphate on Ottoman lands after World War I, at the very same time, secret negotiations between the British and the French was taking place. These negotiations were led by the British diplomat Mark Sykes and the French diplomat François-Georges Picot. These negotiations conclude on May 1916, and in fact, they were about dividing up the Middle East under the control of the British and the French after the war. In other words, at the time the British were promising the Sharif Hussein to sponsor an Arab caliphate in the Middle East on Ottoman lands conquered after World War I. The same lands were being divided up by the British and the French in these negotiations known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So, as you can understand, there is a deep contradiction between these two events, the event of the Hussein-McMahon correspondence and the Sykes-Picot Agreement, since both events, both negotiations, if you like, were about the same lands in the Middle East. The Sykes-Picot Agreement granted the French direct control over the eastern Mediterranean coast, including all of current-day Lebanon, the coastal region of Syria, and a portion of southern Turkey. The rest of modern-day Syria to be under French sphere of influence. Now, according to the agreement, the British will gain control over the southern portions of today's Iraq, with a broader sphere of influence that ran from the coastal areas between Lebanon and Egypt, over the Jordan River through to Baghdad and Kirkuk, all including also Palestine. Now, Russia, at the time of the agreement, which was still Imperial Russia, was a party to the original secret negotiations between the British and the French, since they were also interested in claiming certain Ottoman territories around the Black Sea with the conclusion of the war. But, as you know, something happened in Russia as the World War I progressed, and that is the triumph of the Bolshevik, the Communist Revolution in 1917. Now, with this new regime in Russia, they renounced all those claims that were originally made together with the British and the French, and in addition, they released the details of these secret negotiations between the French and the British. So, in fact, very soon the Sharif Hussein and the Arab people will know that this secret agreement was taking place between Sykes and Picot at the time that the British were promising them to sponsor a large independent state on Ottoman land. As you can imagine, the Sharif Hussein and the Hashemite family were very upset when they realized the betrayal of the British. And in 1916, by the end of the year, the Sharif Hussein himself, he took upon becoming the king of Hejaz in the Arabian Peninsula. But this was a kingdom that lasted only until 1924, when he was defeated by the family of Saud, who eventually will be founding the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, becoming the state of Saudi Arabia as we know it today. As a sort of compensation after the war, the British will make Hussein's sons kings of Iraq. Faisal will be king of Iraq, and another son of Hussein, Abdullah, will become king of Transjordan, later to change its name to Jordan as we know it today. Now, if you look on these two maps that we have in this slide, you can compare the lands above in brown that were promised to Sharif Hussein via the McMahon-Hussein correspondence, on which all those lands will become a large independent Arab state, and that included Palestine, though there is a disagreement between historians about the exactitude of what I just have said in terms of Palestine being included or not in the promises of the British to Hussein. And in the map below, the second map, you can see the division between French and British influence and control on the same lands, more or less, that were promised to Sharif Hussein of Mecca. Let us remember that the Ottoman Empire grew increasingly fragile in the early 20th century already, with major territorial losses in the Balkans, Libya, and elsewhere. And then World War I came and led to the empire's disappearance. The 4 years during the war were terrible for all the residents of the empire in terms of severe shortages, starvation, disease. Animals were drafted, and also conscription of most working age men was very broad. Greater Syria, which included Palestine and present-day Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, it is estimated to have suffered 500,000 deaths during the war only due to famine. The Ottoman Empire overall had the heaviest wartime losses of any major combatant power, with over 3 million people dead, which represented back then 15% of the total population of the empire. Most of these casualties were civilians, and that includes also a number of massacres at the behest of the Ottoman authorities in 1915 and 1916 of the Armenians, the Assyrians, and other Christian groups. Now, in terms of Arab casualties from the Ottoman side, these were also very high, since the army units recruited in Iraq and Greater Syria were heavily represented on battlegrounds such as the Ottoman Eastern Front against Russia, Gallipoli, Sinai, Palestine, and Iraq. It is estimated that during the war, Palestine population declined by 6%. Now, from the spring of 1917 through the late fall, the southern parts of the country of Palestine were the scene of a series of battles between the British, the Anzac forces, and the Ottomans. Those were backed by German and Austrian troops as well. Eventually, in December 1917, British forces captured Jerusalem, and from there it was only a few months until they conquered the rest of the country. Now, if you look again at the map representing the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, you can see basically three major areas, those under French influence, those under British influence or control, and in the area of Palestine, what was agreed between the French and the British, as you can see in the map, is a sort of international condominium to be run by the British, the French, and other international forces. That was essentially what was agreed in the Sykes-Picot Agreement. If you look down to the south, you can see that the Arabian Peninsula was not included in this agreement. So back to the Hussein-McMahon correspondence, you can see that the British and the French thought to leave the Arabian Peninsula to the Sharif Hussein, to the Hashemite family, but the rest of the Arab regions under Ottoman control were already divided up by the British and the French, in contrast to, let me repeat this again, in contrast to what was promised to Sharif Hussein in the Hussein-McMahon correspondence. Now, the Sykes-Picot Agreement has a significant place in the history of the region because this agreement and this dividing up of Arab regions, cultures, societies in the Middle East will have a tremendous effect on the Middle East for years to come, I would say to these very days. And this is simply because colonial forces, the British and the French, disregarded the actual reality of these Arab societies, the actual division and common spaces, and just divided the region according to their own interest. In November 1917, even before British forces actually conquered Jerusalem, the Zionist movement was rewarded with the Balfour Declaration. This document, issued by Arthur Balfour, the Foreign Affairs Secretary of the British government, promised a benevolent British attitude towards the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. The letter itself, what became to be known as the Balfour Declaration, was addressed to Lord Rothschild, who was back then the president of the British Zionist Association. And the letter itself said, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. So, the Balfour Declaration was a promise made by the British government to the Zionist organization that the British will act to further a Jewish national home in Palestine. This declaration assumes obviously that the British will control Palestine after the war and will do whatever they can to help the Zionists to found a national home, or in more plain words, a Jewish state. So we can say that if there were Palestinians, Arab Palestinians, before the war that had begun to regard the Zionist movement as a threat, the Balfour Declaration introduced a new and fearsome element. It, in fact, stated that the home of the Arab Palestinians will be given to the Jews to found a Jewish state. Let's have a deeper look at the declaration itself to note something very interesting. The declaration says that the British government will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, that is a national home for the Jewish people. And then it also says, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. That is, in the declaration, there is no clear mention that the overwhelming majority of Palestine are Arabs, Muslim and Christians. There are no Arabs in this declaration, but non-Jewish communities. This is very strange given that the Jews at that time were around 9 to 10% of the population, and the Arabs were the majority. And nonetheless, for the British, the Arab indigenous people of Palestine simply do not exist and are regarded as non-Jewish community, that is defined as the negative or the opposite of the Jewish minority. When you read this declaration and you don't have a background of the demographics back then that we do have, you probably wonder that the Jewish community in Palestine were the majority and the Arabs were the minority, because this is the language used in the declaration. As you can see, this commitment in its language and political will that it sets, it is favoring the Zionist organization and the Jewish settlers in Palestine. Before securing British backing to the Zionist project, the Zionist movement had been a colonizing project in search for a great power patron. If you remember, Herzl failed to find a sponsor in the Ottoman Empire after his meeting with the Sultan. He also failed in persuading Germany to sponsor Zionist colonization. And eventually, the person who succeeded to secure a sponsor was Chaim Weizmann, one of the most important Zionist leaders after Herzl. Weizmann began his dealing with the British government early in World War I when he was recruited as a scientist in the service of the British military, and he managed to connect himself with a number of people in the British government, and eventually he was responsible for the drafting of the Balfour Declaration and the fact that the British government issued that declaration. Now, again, I would like to stress this. The Balfour Declaration refers to the Arab people of Palestine, at least 90% of the population at that time, as the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. So again, the words Palestinian and Arab do not appear in the words of the declaration. And the best that the British government is willing to grant, if you look a slide back into the text itself of the declaration, is that it promised to the non-Jewish communities only civil and religious rights. That is, not political or national rights. And this is at the time that this short text is promising to the Jewish people a national home. Again, about 10% of the population are promised Palestine, whereas the 90% of the population are not even mentioned in the declaration. From the moment the British conquered Palestine militarily and until 1920, Palestine was governed by a British military administration. In 1920, the military administration was replaced with a civil administration headed by a High Commissioner, as the British used to have in other colonies. The first High Commissioner for Palestine was Herbert Samuel, himself a Zionist Jew. In summary, the negotiations on Palestine's future produced three documents: the Hussein-McMahon Correspondence, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and the Balfour Declaration. Each included a promise for the local population. In ambiguous language, each promise contradicted the other two. The first associated the future of Palestine with that of an Arab Hashemite kingdom or caliphate in the Arab world. The second proposed placing Palestine under Anglo-French colonial rule. And the last envisaged Palestine as a future Jewish state. Undoubtedly, for the Zionist movement, First World War was a turning point that put things on their side. The Versailles Peace Conference and Treaty of 1919 ended World War I and also created the League of Nations, which was the international institution that preceded the United Nations of today. At the Paris or Versailles conference, and then a few months later the San Remo conference, the elite victors, Britain, France, and other associated powers, they created the international system of mandates, which was devised to control the territories and the populations that were conquered, mainly from the Ottoman Empire. In other words, the independence of the Arab territories, formerly under Ottoman rule, would be managed by the European powers victorious in World War One. Remember that this arrangement was already worked out previously in the secret negotiations between Sykes and Picot. A mandate regime was not exactly a classical European colony, but these were territories and populations directly controlled by European colonial powers, in principle, until the populations in these territories would be able to rule themselves independently. Britain received the administration, that is, the mandate of Mesopotamia from 1920 to 1932, before the creation of the Kingdom of Iraq. It also received the mandate of Palestine from 1923 and until 1948, when the State of Israel was established, and also the mandate from Transjordan from 1921 to 1946. The French, adding to their extensive holdings in North Africa, they received the administration of the mandate of Syria from 1923 to 1944, and this mandate included also the territory of modern-day Lebanon, that eventually became a separated republic upon the end of the mandate in 1943. At this point, I am asking you to go into Moodle and download the letter of the mandate for Palestine that you will find there. You can read from the actual original document or from a print of the mandate for Palestine, and answer the following question: what are the main points in the mandate letter from the viewpoint of the Zionist-Palestine conflict? That is, what I'm asking you to do is to look into the letter of the mandate and see how this mandate accommodated the wishes of the two sides, if at all. Well, assuming that you've read the letter of the mandate for Palestine, you can now see that the British mandate for Palestine, the letter that authorized the mandate, actually endorsed and included the Balfour Declaration that was meant to express the support of the British government to establish a Jewish national home in Palestine. The draft for the British mandate for Palestine was approved originally at the San Remo conference in 1920. Later it was submitted to the League of Nations and finally approved by the League of Nations in 1922. As you can see from the short article on the right of this slide from the Times, April 1920, At the time this draft was circulating on the international spheres of the victorious power and the different conferences they held, you can see the joy of the Zionist movement and its representatives, knowing that Britain will rule over Palestine, and that ruling will endorse the Balfour Declaration. The preamble of the mandate document itself says it all. To quote, whereas the principal allied powers have also agreed that the mandatory should be responsible for putting into effect the declaration originally made on November the 2nd, 1917 by the government of His Britannic Majesty and adopted by the said powers in favor of the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, it being clearly understood that nothing should be done which might prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. So again, you can see a copy-paste operation of the Balfour Declaration into the mandate document, only that the support of the Balfour Promise have now escalated to an international level where the powers of the world have agreed to support the idea of the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. So this is not anymore the support of the colonial power itself that is going to rule in Palestine and will certainly help the Zionist organization to pursue this goal, but this promise is now supported and backed by international documents and by the highest international institution just established, which is the League of Nations. And again, we see here the imbalance between the Jews in Palestine and the Arabs or Palestinians, not even mentioned in this document and referred to as existing non-Jewish communities, as if they were small minorities, when in fact they were about 90% of the population. You can also see the imbalance between the political rights that are going to be bestowed on the Zionist organization, that is the establishment of a national home, which is a code name for a Jewish state, whereas on the other hand, the Arabs of Palestine, referred to us here as the non-Jewish communities, will only enjoy from civil and religious rights. That is, no sovereign aim, no political rights are being referred to as something that should be bestowed to the Arabs of Palestine. So again, to sum up, the Charter of the Mandate for Palestine was committed to a Jewish national home, and on the other hand, just to civil and religious rights of the Arab, Christians and Muslims, even though these were not explicitly mentioned in the mandate document. This took place where the demographic balance was that the Arabs of Palestine constituted 90% of the population, where in fact they were treated only as non-Jewish communities, as if the Jewish community in Palestine was the majority. As said, this political momentum that was backing the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine was a phenomenal achievement for the Zionist organization and for the Zionist project itself on the ground in Palestine. If we only compare to the status of the Zionists during the last years of the Ottoman Empire, remember that the Ottomans were trying to stop Jewish immigration and were trying to stop purchasing of land by the Zionist organizations, not without much success, but the Zionists had to face that kind of objections on the side of the Ottoman government. Whereas now Britain will be supporting and backing, as the ruling power in Palestine, will be supporting and backing the Zionist settlement in Palestine. You can imagine that from now onwards, Palestinian resistance will start to change and eventually will turn more violent from early 1920s. What we are going to do in the next slides is to look into the institutional mechanisms that derive from the mandate document for the sake of fulfilling the promise of the Jewish state, now backed by the international documentation and international institutions. The mandate essentially allowed for the creation of a Zionist administration in Palestine parallel to the administration of the ruling British mandatory government, which in fact was tasked with fostering and supporting the Zionist administration and the goal of establishing a Jewish national home, as set first in the Balfour Declaration from 1917. This parallel Zionist body, this parallel governmental body, was meant to exercise for one part of the population, that is, for the Jewish population only, that comprise about 10%, many of the functions of a sovereign state, including democratic representation and control of education, health, public works, and even international diplomacy. That is, this Zionist para-government enjoyed all the attributes of sovereignty at the time that the Palestinians were deprived from such level of action and representation. According to the letter of the mandate, a Zionist commission was organized in Europe around March 1918. Its mission was to assist the British government in Palestine to implement the Balfour Declaration. It was first chaired by Chaim Weizmann, the person who has been behind the scenes shaping the draft of the Balfour Declaration. And you can see Weizmann in his white suit here in the photograph, together with the other members of the Zionist Commission. The commission arrived to Palestine on 14th of April 1918. At the beginning of the ongoing military British administration was not very sympathetic to the Zionist Commission, but eventually, when this was replaced by the civil administration under the High Commissioner Herbert Samuel, things changed for the better from the viewpoint of the Zionist Commission. What the Commission did? Well, the Zionist Commission, coming as a future government for the Jewish community in Palestine, restructured the Palestine office. If you remember, the Palestine office was established in 1908 and was headed by Arthur Ruppin. The Zionist Commission, in fact, absorbed the Palestine office and it was reorganized, as we just mentioned, as a proper government with departments in various areas of life. Later in time, in 1920, Menachem Usishkin, that we discussed last week, was appointed as the head of the Zionist Commission, which again was a sort of being appointed to like a prime minister for the para-government of the Yishuv. 1 year later, the Zionist Commission was officially the Palestine Zionist Executive, in fact called the Eretz Israel Zionist Executive, and its formal name, as it was set in the mandate, was the Jewish Agency. So again, the Jewish Agency was the formal name of the Jewish Zionist government in Palestine during the early stages of the British Mandate. In the meantime, the Yishuv continued to develop. In 1920, perhaps the most important institution, economically and socially speaking, was established. This was the Histadrut. The Histadrut was originally a trade union called the General Organization of Jewish Workers in the Yishuv, and it was fundamental in establishing solidarity among the Jewish workers in their quest to conquer labor from Arab workers, but also the Histadrut developed a series of cooperatives that supplied actual work for Jewish immigrants and Jewish residents in Palestine. During the years, the Histadrut established a number of different cooperatives that offer work. Some of them were incorporated into the Histadrut that were established before its foundation. So by mid-1920s, the Histadrut was able to offer work in a number of trades. It had a consumer cooperative, it had a building and construction company, it established a bank, it established a workers' health fund, it established an agricultural cooperative that served the kibbutzim in order to market their agricultural and dairy products, and it also had a public transport cooperative. So as you can see, the Yishuv was continuing to be developed economically, and the Histadrut was a paramount institution in the consolidation, the economic consolidation of the Yishuv. Important to say is that the jobs offered by the Histadrut were offered only to Jewish workers. So the Histadrut helped segregating the economy in Palestine and dividing it up. During the 1920s, the Histadrut and other associations within the Yishuv also developed a policy called Totzeret Haaretz, which basically means made in the country. The Totzeret Haaretz policy was designed to promote among the Jewish residents of Palestine to buy products only from Jewish shops and manufacturers who have employed only Jews in the manufacturing of the products that they were selling. You have here in the slide an illustration of the Totzeret Haaretz policy. This poster here is promoting cigarettes, and in the bottom of the poster it says Hebrew labor Totzeret Haaretz. So basically, the Totzeret Haaretz policy brought together these two ideas of Hebrew produce made by Hebrew labor. Obviously, the idea of Totzeret Haaretz and buying only from Jews helped further segregating the economy in Palestine, and eventually the Arabs will reciprocate with a similar boycott policy, encouraging Arabs in Palestine to buy only from Arab people, Arab shops, and Arab manufacturers. For the last activity in this week, I'm asking you to watch the documentary The Diaries of Yosef Nachmani. Yosef Nachmani was a Zionist land agent that worked for various Zionist agencies in Palestine and had a very important role in the purchasing of land. The documentary shows the significance of this activity for the development of the Yishuv, and from the middle of the movie, more or less, you will also start seeing the developments in the country later when the 1948 war began.